Frank handed his last $20 to the homeless woman, ignoring the hunger that twisted his own empty stomach. The CEO, watching from her luxury limousine, wiped away unexpected tears, her privileged world shattered by a street sweeper's raw compassion. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Frank Reeves started his day the same way he had for the past 7 years, with a gentle kiss on his daughter Lily's forehead before quietly slipping out the door at 4:30 a.m. The small one-bedroom apartment they shared in the forgotten corner of the city was still dark, matching the pre-dawn sky outside. He paused at the door, watching her small form curled beneath the faded butterfly blanket, a gift from her mother before cancer stole her away 3 years ago. "See you after school, sweetheart," he whispered, though she couldn't hear him. The city streets were empty as Frank made his way to the municipal depot where the orange uniform waited for him. The road sweeper wasn't a glamorous job, but it was honest work that paid enough to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table most days anyway. This month had been harder than most. Lily's asthma medication had wiped out what little savings they had, and with 3 days until payday, Frank had exactly $20 to his name, just enough for Lily's school lunch money and maybe a simple dinner tonight. As the sun began to peek over the steel and glass horizon of downtown, Frank pushed his sweeper cart along his route, the familiar weight of the broom in his calloused hands almost comforting. He worked methodically, clearing debris from sidewalks and gutters, nodding politely to early morning commuters who rarely acknowledged his existence. He was part of the invisible workforce that kept the city running, seen but unseen, present but forgotten. It was just past 9 when Frank rounded the corner onto Monroe Street, an upscale shopping district where luxury cars idled outside designer boutiques. This wasn't his usual route, but Jenkins had called in sick and Frank had volunteered for the extra block. The overtime would help, even if it was just a few dollars more. That's when he saw her, huddled against a building's ornate facade. An elderly woman, perhaps in her 70s, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing despite the mild autumn air. Her weathered face was partially hidden beneath a gray woolen scarf, but Frank could see the hollow resignation in her eyes as passers-by swerved around her, their gazes averted as if homelessness was contagious. Frank slowed his cart. He'd seen countless homeless people during his years working the streets. Some he knew by name, like old Pete, who collected cans near the park, or Maria, who sold hand-knitted scarves in winter. But this woman was new, and something about her quiet dignity tugged at him. He watched as a well-dressed businessman dropped a few coins into the small cup beside her without breaking stride. The woman whispered a thank you that went unheard. A teenage girl took a quick photo with her phone before hurrying away, probably for some social media post about urban poverty. Frank's hand moved to his pocket, fingers brushing against the worn $20 bill, his lifeline until Friday. He thought of Lily, of the peanut butter sandwiches he'd packed for her lunch today, of the macaroni and cheese waiting for dinner tonight. His last $20, the only thing between them and hunger. But as he looked at the elderly woman again, he saw something else. A small, handwritten sign resting beside her that simply read, "Need medicine. God bless." The words hit him like a physical blow. Just last week, he'd faced the pharmacist with the same desperate need in his heart, counting out crumpled bills for Lily's inhaler. Before he could talk himself out of it, Frank approached her. Up close, he could see the slight tremor in her hands, the wheezing quality of her breath. "Morning, ma'am," he said softly, kneeling down to her level. She looked up, startled by the direct address, eyes wary but curious. "Good morning," she replied, her voice surprisingly melodic despite its fragility. "I'm Frank," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the $20 bill. "I hope this helps with your medicine." Her eyes widened as she stared at the money, then at his face, searching for the catch, the cruelty, or the pity. She found none. Only the simple recognition of one struggling soul to another. "Can't take that," she whispered. "It looks like too much." Frank smiled. "My daughter says we've got to help each other out. That's how the world gets better." He gently placed the bill in her trembling hand and closed her fingers around it. "Get your medicine, ma'am, please." A tear slid down her weathered cheek. "My name's Ruth," she said. "I used to be a kindergarten teacher. Before," she gestured vaguely at herself, at the circumstances that had brought her to this street corner. "Your students were lucky to have you, Ruth," Frank replied, standing up. "You take care now." As he turned back to his cart, Frank didn't notice the sleek black limousine idling across the street, nor the woman watching the interaction through the tinted window, her manicured hand frozen on the door handle. Inside the luxury vehicle, Alexandra Harrington, CEO of Harrington Pharmaceuticals, sat transfixed. She had been on her way to the quarterly board meeting when traffic had forced her driver to take this detour. Now she found herself witnessing something that made her carefully constructed world tilt on its axis. A city worker in a faded orange uniform giving what was clearly his last bit of money to a homeless woman. The simple act of kindness, offered without hesitation and with no audience in mind, struck Alexandra with unexpected force. She watched the road sweeper return to his cart, his shoulders a little heavier but his step somehow lighter. The homeless woman clutched the money to her chest like a precious artifact. Something hot and unfamiliar pricked at Alexandra's eyes. Tears. She hadn't cried since her father's funeral 5 years ago, when she'd inherited the pharmaceutical empire he'd built, an empire that under her leadership had tripled its profits by raising prices on essential medications, including the common asthma inhaler, that now cost patients over $200 without insurance. "Ma'am?" Her driver's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're running late for your meeting." "Wait," Alexandra said, her voice strange even to her own ears. She reached for the door handle, compelled by an impulse she didn't fully understand. The board could wait. The quarterly projections could wait. The acquisition plans and the stock options and the press release, all of it suddenly seemed hollow compared to the simple exchange she'd just witnessed. A man with nothing giving what little he had. Alexandra stepped out of the limousine, the cool autumn air hitting her face, mingling with the warmth of her unexpected tears. The street sounds rushed in. Traffic, distant sirens, the rhythmic scraping of the sweeper's broom as he worked his way down the block. Ruth looked up in surprise as the elegant woman in the tailored suit approached, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. "Excuse me," Alexandra said, her voice catching slightly. "The man who was just here, the street cleaner. Do you know his name?" Ruth nodded slowly, still clutching the $20 bill. "Frank," she said. "He gave me this for my medicine. Said his daughter taught him about helping others." Pause, studying Alexandra's face. "Are you all right, miss? You look upset." Alexandra glanced down the street where Frank was still visible, his orange uniform bright against the gray cityscape. "I'm fine," she replied automatically, though she wasn't sure that was true anymore. "I just need to speak with him." Single quotes as she walked away. Following the road sweeper's path, Alexandra felt something shift inside her. A crack in the armor of indifference she'd carefully cultivated in the boardrooms and executive suites. That man, Frank, had just given everything he had to a stranger. What had she, with all her wealth and power, ever given without calculating the return? The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows on the city streets as Alexandra Harrington, heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, walked purposefully after a road sweeper who had nothing left but the compassion in his heart. Frank continued his methodical work down Monroe Street, his mind already calculating the adjustments he'd need to make to stretch their food until payday. Maybe M's. And Garcia next door would let Lily join them for dinner tomorrow, she'd offered before, saying her grandkids rarely visited and she always cooked too much. Pride had made him decline in the past, but Lily's needs came before his pride. He didn't regret giving the money to Ruth, not really. The tight knot in his stomach was just practical concern, not doubt. He'd figure something out. He always did. Behind him, Alexandra quickened her pace, suddenly uncertain about what she planned to say when she caught up to him. The board meeting would be starting without her, an unprecedented absence that would already have her assistant fielding concerned messages. None of that seemed to matter. She was driven forward by an unfamiliar compulsion, a need to understand what she'd witnessed. "Excuse me," she called out when she was several yards behind him. Frank turned, his broom pausing mid-sweep. He took in the tailored pantsuit, the designer handbag, the impeccable hair and makeup, clearly someone who wanted to report a missed piece of trash or complain about. His cart blocking access to a store entrance. "Yes, ma'am? Is there a problem?" he asked, straightening his posture. Alexandra faltered under his direct gaze. In the boardroom, she never hesitated. Facing shareholders or politicians or reporters, she was unflappable. But here on the street, confronting the simple dignity of this man, words failed her. I saw what you did," she finally said, "with the homeless woman back there." Frank's expression shifted subtly, a wariness entering his eyes. Was he in trouble somehow? Had he violated some city ordinance by interacting with Ruth? "I was just talking to her," he said carefully, making sure she was all right. "You gave her money?" Alexandra pressed. "It looked like ... A lot." Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the scrutiny. "Just $20. She needed medicine." "Was that all you had?" The question escaped before Alexandra could consider how invasive it was. The silence that followed answered more eloquently than words could have. Frank's gaze dropped momentarily to his worn work boots before meeting hers again, a flicker of defensiveness crossing his features. "I should get back to work," he said, his tone polite but firm. "The city doesn't pay me to chat." As he turned back to his cart, Alexandra surprised herself by reaching out to touch his arm. "Wait, please. I'm Alexandra Harrington." She extended her hand automatically, as if they were meeting at a business function. Frank looked at her outstretched hand, then carefully removed his work glove before accepting the handshake. "Frank Reeves. Mr. Reeves, what you did back there ... single quotes." She paused, struggling to articulate the impact of his simple act of kindness. It was extraordinary. He looked genuinely confused. "It wasn't anything special, Ms. Harrington. Just trying to help someone out, but you was your last $20, wasn't it?" When he didn't immediately deny it, she continued, "Why would you do that?" Frank sighed, glancing at his watch. His supervisor would be making rounds soon. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but I've got a schedule to keep. I'll walk with you," Alexandra said, surprising both of them. She fell into step beside him as he pushed his cart forward. "Please, I'd like to understand." Frank studied her for a moment, trying to make sense of this elegant woman's interest in it. Finally, he shrugged. "My daughter Lily had an asthma attack last week. Bad one. Her inhaler was empty and the new one cost more than I expected. Almost couldn't afford it. Single quotes. His jaw tightened at the memory. "When I saw that woman's sign saying she needed medicine ... Well, I've been in those shoes, that's all. Alexandra felt each word like a physical blow. Harrington Pharmaceuticals manufactured that inhaler. Under her direction, they had raised its price 3 times in the past year. You have a daughter? She asked, deflecting from her sudden discomfort. Frank's expression softened. She's 8, smart as a whip and twice as quick. He pulled out his phone and showed Alexandra the lock screen. A smiling girl with her father's eyes and a gap-toothed grin, holding up a science fair ribbon. She's beautiful, Alexandra said truthfully. Her mother must be proud. Her mother passed 3 years ago. Cancer. The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but Alexandra caught the slight hitch in his voice. It's just us now. They walked in silence for half a block, the morning bustle of the city flowing around them, an unlikely pair that attracted curious glances from passers-by. What about you? Frank finally asked. Shouldn't you be in some important meeting instead of following a street sweeper around? Alexandra smiled wryly. Yes, actually. A quarterly board meeting for my company. And yet here you are. Why? It was a simple question that demanded an honest answer. Alexandra had been asking herself the same thing since stepping out of her limousine. Because I can't remember the last time I did something without calculating what I'd get in return, she admitted. And I watched you give everything you had left to a complete stranger. Frank looked uncomfortable with her assessment. It wasn't everything. We've got a roof over our heads, food in the fridge. Some people don't even have that. They reached a corner where Frank needed to empty a public trash. Alexandra waited as he efficiently transferred the contents into his cart. His movements were practiced, dignified, a man taking pride in work that most people never noticed. Reeves, Alexandra said when he finished. I'd like to repay you for your kindness to that woman. Frank's expression immediately closed. That's not why I did it. I know that, she said quickly. That's exactly the point. But please let me... No, thank you, he interrupted firmly. I appreciate the thought, but I don't need charity. Alexandra felt a flash of frustration. In her world, problems were solved with money. Efficiency demanded it. A homeless woman needs medicine? Write a check. A single father struggling? Offer cash. Clean, simple transactions that required minimal emotional investment. But Frank's refusal forced her to look beyond that familiar framework. This wasn't about money. It was about something she'd lost touch with long ago. The simple human connection and giving without expectation. It's not charity. She tried again. It's paying it forward. Frank checked his watch again and sighed. Ms. Herring, you seem like a nice lady, but I've got 3 more blocks to finish before my lunch break. And my supervisor's a stickler for schedules. Of course, Alexandra stepped back, suddenly aware of her intrusion into his workday. I'm sorry for holding you up. She watched as he nodded politely and continued down the street, the wheels of his cart squeaking slightly. The gap between their worlds had never felt wider, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that this chance encounter was significant, that she was meant to witness his act of kindness. As Frank disappeared around a corner, Alexandra pulled out her phone and called her assistant. Joanna, I won't be returning to the office today. Cancel my afternoon appointments. She paused, ignoring the surprised questions from the other end. And I need you to find information on a city employee, a street cleaner named Frank Reeves. Yes, it's important. No, I can't explain right now. After ending the call, Alexandra walked back toward her waiting limousine, her mind racing. For the first time in years, the quarterly reports and market projections seemed trivial compared to the image burned into her memory. A man in an orange uniform giving his last $20 to someone in need. Back at her limousine, Alexandra found her driver looking concerned. Everything all right, Miss Harrington? She glanced in the direction Frank had gone, then back to the spot where Ruth had been sitting. The homeless woman was gone now. Probably to find the pharmacy she desperately needed. No, James, she answered thoughtfully. I don't think everything is all right, but maybe it could be. As the limousine pulled away from the curb, Alexandra made a decision. The board could run without her today. The company would survive her absence. There was something more important she needed to understand. Something about value and worth and the true cost of compassion. Something a road sweeper with $20 to his name seemed to grasp more clearly than she, with all her billions, ever had. Frank finished his shift at 3:15 p.m., his shoulders aching from the day's labor. Without his $20, he'd skipped lunch, ignoring the hollow feeling in his stomach. Could figure something out for dinner. The community pantry 2 blocks from their apartment might have some canned goods left. It wasn't ideal. He hated going there, hated the looks of pity, the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, but Lily needed to eat. He changed out of his orange uniform at the depot, hanging it carefully in his assigned locker. 7 years of this job, and he still took pride in keeping his gear neat and clean. It was one of the few things in his life he could control. Reeves, a voice called out as he was leaving. His supervisor, Mike Donovan, waved him over to the small office by the entrance. Frank's stomach tightened. He couldn't afford any trouble, not with rent due next week and Lily's school field trip money needed by Friday. Everything okay, Mike? He asked, trying to sound casual. Mike looked uncomfortable, shifting papers on his desk. Got a call about you today? A complaint? Frank asked, mentally reviewing his route. Had he missed something? Offended someone? Quote, no, nothing like that. Some executive type asking questions. Woman named Harrington. Frank's eyebrows rose in surprise. Alexandra Harrington? Tall, expensive suit, probably could buy this whole building without checking her account balance. That's the one, Mike confirmed. Her office called, asking about your employment record, how long you've worked here, that sort of thing. I told them I couldn't release personal information without authorization. He studied Frank's face. You in some kind of trouble, Reeves? No. Frank said slowly, trying to make sense of this development. I met her this morning on my route. She saw me give some money to a homeless woman. No big deal. Well, people like that don't usually take an interest in people like us unless they want something, Mike warned. Just watch yourself. Frank nodded, his mind racing as he left the depot. Why would Alexandra Harrington be looking into him? Their brief encounter had been strange, but hardly worth the CEO of a major corporation's time. The whole thing made him uneasy. The afternoon sun was low in the sky as he walked to Lily's after-school program, a subsidized service that allowed him to work his full shift. The neighborhood changed gradually as he walked, office buildings giving way to apartments, then to the mixed-income housing complex where they lived. His unease about Alexandra Harrington was temporarily forgotten when he spotted Lily waiting by the playground fence, her backpack clutched to her chest. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she ran over, wrapping her arms around his waist. Dad, guess what? I got an A on my science project. Miss Winters said my experiment on water filtration was the best in class. Frank hugged her tightly, his chest swelling with pride. That's my girl. I knew all that hard work would pay off. They walked home together, Lily chattering about her day, Frank asking questions and marveling at her boundless enthusiasm. These moments were precious. The simple joy of listening to his daughter's voice, watching her hands gesticulate wildly as she described a classroom debate about pollution. Dad? Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. What's for dinner? I'm starving. Frank hesitated, guilt washing over him. I thought we might check out the community pantry tonight, see what they've got. Lily's face fell slightly, but she quickly recovered. Could we get those canned peaches again? They were really good last time. His daughter's easy acceptance of their circumstances sometimes broke his heart. She never complained, never demanded things they couldn't afford. At 8 years old, she understood budget constraints better than most adults. We'll definitely look for peaches, he promised, squeezing her hand. As they approached their apartment building, Frank noticed an unfamiliar car parked out front, a sleek black sedan that looked wildly out of place in their neighborhood. His steps slowed instinctively. Standing beside the car, looking simultaneously powerful and uncomfortable, was Alexandra Harrington. She spotted them immediately, her posture straightening as they approached. Frank felt Lily press closer to his side, suddenly shy in the presence of this elegant stranger. Mr. Reeves, Alexandra said, stepping forward. I hope you don't mind my coming here. Your supervisor wouldn't give me your contact information, so I had to ... so you had someone track down my address? Frank finished, a defensive edge to his voice. He placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. Alexandra had the grace to look embarrassed. It sounds intrusive when you put it that way. I apologize. Her gaze shifted to Lily and her expression softened. You must be Lily. Your father told me about you. Lily looked up at Frank questioningly. This is Miss Harrington, Frank explained. I met her during work today. Hello, Lily said politely, though she remained partially hidden behind her father. An awkward silence settled between the adults, broken only by the distant sounds of traffic and neighbors arriving home from work. Mr. Reeves, could we speak privately for a moment? Alexandra finally asked. It's important. Frank hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Lily, honey, why don't you go upstairs and start your homework? I'll be up in a few minutes. But Dad, Lily began to protest. It's okay, sweetheart. Here's the key. I won't be long. He handed her the apartment key and watched as she reluctantly entered the building, glancing back several times before disappearing inside. Once they were alone, Frank turned to Alexandra, crossing his arms. This is crossing a line, Miss Harrington. Coming to my home involving my supervisor, I know, she interrupted, and I'm sorry. But after our conversation this morning, I couldn't stop thinking about what you did, about why you did it. Frank shook his head in disbelief. It was $20 to someone who needed it more than I did. It wasn't a heroic act, but it was. Alexandra insisted, her voice dropping. Do you know what my company makes? The abrupt change of subject caught him off guard. Pharmaceuticals, right? I've seen the name on medication packaging, yes, including asthma inhaler. She watched his face carefully. The same type of inhaler your daughter uses. Frank's expression hardened. What's your point, Miss Herring? 3 years ago, that inhaler cost $60. Now it's over $200. Do you know why? She didn't wait for his answer. Because I approved the price increases. 3 of them. I signed the papers that made that medication nearly impossible for families like yours to afford. Frank stared at her, trying to process this confession. Why are you telling me this? Alexandra looked away, her composure cracking slightly. Because until today, they were just numbers on a spreadsheet to me. Profit margins, market share, quarterly earnings. She met his gaze again. Then I watched you give your last $20 to a homeless woman who needed medicine. And I realized I'd lost touch with the human cost of my decisions. The irony was almost too much. Frank let out a hollow laugh. So I'm what? Your wake-up call? It's your chance at redemption? No, Alexandra replied quickly. You're the person who made me see that I've been measuring success all wrong. She reached into her handbag and pulled out an envelope. This isn't charity, Mr. Reeves. It's restitution. Frank didn't take the envelope. I told you this morning I don't want your money. It's not for you, Alexandra countered. It's for Ruth, the woman you helped. I found her at the pharmacy trying to fill a prescription she still couldn't afford, even with your $20. I paid for her medication in a hotel room for the next month. She held out the envelope again. This is to replace the money you gave her. Nothing more. Frank hesitated, then slowly accepted the envelope. Thank you for helping. That was ... Decent of you. That was the least I could do. Alexandra glanced up at the apartment building. Its facade showing years of neglect, but it's not enough. Not by a long shot. Frank studied her, trying to understand the transformation he was witnessing. This morning she had been every inch the corporate executive, confident and removed from ordinary struggles. Now there was something different in her eyes, a vulnerability, a questioning. "What do you want from me, Ms. Herring?" he asked directly. "Perspective," she answered without hesitation. "I run a company that makes life-saving medication, yet I've been complicit in making them unaffordable for the people who need them most. I want to change that, but I need to understand what families like yours are really facing." Frank considered her words carefully. "And how exactly do you propose to get that perspective?" "I'd like to help your daughter, for starters. Not with handouts," she added quickly, seeing his expression, "but with access to the medication she needs, at a price that doesn't force her father to go hungry." The mention of hunger made Frank's stomach growl audibly, betraying the fact that he hadn't eaten all day. Alexandra's eyes widened slightly. "You skipped meals to afford her medicine, didn't you?" she asked softly. "And after giving away that $20, you probably haven't eaten today at all." Frank's silence was answer enough. Alexandra shook her head, a mixture of admiration and dismay crossing her features. "Mr. Reeves, would you and Lily join me for dinner tonight? No strings attached, just a meal and conversation. I have a proposition that might benefit both of us, but I'd like to discuss it properly, and you shouldn't have to do that on an empty stomach." Frank wanted to refuse on principle. He didn't need this wealthy woman's pity or her charity, but the thought of Lily's face when he told her they'd be having a real dinner instead of canned goods from the pantry ... "Just dinner," he said finally, "and I'll listen to your proposition. But I'm not promising anything beyond that." Alexandra nodded, relief evident in her expression. "That's all I'm asking. Thank you." As Frank turned to go upstairs and get Lily, he wondered what he was getting them into. This woman lived in a different world, a world of board meetings and limousines and power. Yet something told him that their paths crossing wasn't just coincidence. Perhaps this strange day, which had begun with him giving away his last $20, was about to take an even stranger turn. Lily's eyes widened as they slid into a corner booth at Salvatore's, an upscale Italian restaurant where the prices weren't listed on the menu. Frank had never brought her here, could never bring her here, and her excitement was palpable. She sat up straight, carefully unfolding her napkin onto her lap the way she'd seen people do and move. Alexandra observed the little girl with quiet admiration. Despite her worn clothes and scuffed shoes, Lily carried herself with natural dignity. Frank had clearly raised her well. "Order anything you want, Lily," Alexandra encouraged, smiling at the girl's barely contained wonder. Lily looked to her father questioningly, her ingrained sense of financial restraint making her hesitate even with permission. "It's okay, sweetheart," Frank assured her, though Alexandra noticed the tension in his shoulders as he glanced at the menu prices. "Can I try the spaghetti and meatballs?" Lily asked, selecting perhaps the most modest item available. "Of course," Alexandra replied. "And maybe an appetizer? The calamari here is excellent." Lily's brow furrowed. "What's calamari?" "It's fried squid," Frank explained, having once seen it prepared on a cooking show. "Squid?" Lily's nose wrinkled momentarily before curiosity won out. "I'll try it." The waiter arrived, his professional demeanor slipping momentarily as he took in the unusual trio, a clearly wealthy businesswoman dining with a man and child who looked like they belonged in a different establishment entirely. To his credit, he recovered quickly, taking their orders with perfect courtesy. Once the appetizers arrived and Lily was happily exploring the new culinary experience, declaring after careful consideration that calamari was weird but good, Alexandra turned her attention to Frank. "Thank you for agreeing to dinner," she began. "I realize this must seem strange to you." Frank watched his daughter, ensuring she was sufficiently distracted before responding. "Strange doesn't begin to cover it, Miss Harrington. The CEO of Harrington Pharmaceuticals tracks down a street sweeper because he gave $20 to a homeless one. Yeah, that's beyond strange. Please call me Alexandra." She took a sip of water, gathering her thoughts. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning, about your daughter's medication, the inhaler that costs more than you expected." Frank's expression hardened slightly. "What about it? Do you know that the active ingredient in that inhaler costs less than $5 to produce? The rest is marketing, shareholder dividend, and executive bonuses." Alexandra's voice remained steady, but her fingers tightened around her water glass. "My father started Harrington Pharmaceuticals to help people. His first wife, not my mother, died from an asthma attack. He dedicated his life to making treatments accessible. Well, no offense, but it seems like the company has strayed from that mission," Frank observed. "You're right," Alexandra admitted, surprising him with her candor. "When I took over after his death 5 years ago, I was focused on growth and market position. I listened to the board, to investors, to analysts, everyone except the patients who actually need our product." She glanced at Lily, who was carefully twirling spaghetti around her fork. "Until today, I've never had to face someone who had to choose between food and medicine." Frank remained skeptical. "So what now? One chance encounter and suddenly you're having a crisis of conscience?" "I prefer to think of it as clarity," Alexandra replied. "And yes, watching you give that money to Ruth, your last $20, it hit me harder than any shareholder presentation or market analysis ever could. It made me realize I've been measuring success all wrong." Their entrees arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. conversation. Frank watched as Lily dug into her spaghetti with unrestrained joy, sauce inevitably finding its way onto her cheek. He gently dabbed it away with a napkin, the simple gesture containing such tenderness that Alexandra had to look away. "You mentioned a proposition," Frank prompted after a few bites of his own meal, a dish he would normally consider an unimaginable luxury. Alexandra nodded, setting down her fork. "I want to start a patient advocacy division within Harrington Pharmaceuticals. Not just the usual corporate PR exercise, but something with real teeth. A department that would have direct input on pricing strategies, that would bring the actual experiences of patients into our decision-making process." Frank listened, his expression neutral. "And this involves us how? Exactly." "I'd like to hire you, Mr. Reeves, as a consultant to begin with, but potentially for a permanent position heading this new division." Frank nearly choked on his water. "Me? I'm a street sweeper, not a pharmaceutical exec." "You're exactly who I need," Alexandra insisted. "Someone who understands the real impact of our pricing decisions, who has navigated the healthcare system from the other side, someone with integrity and compassion." "This is crazy," Frank muttered, glancing at Lily to make sure she wasn't listening. She was happily focused on her dessert menus, sounding out the Italian names to herself. "Maybe," Alexandra conceded. "But sometimes crazy is exactly what's needed to change a broken system." The position would come with full benefits, including comprehensive health insurance for both you and Lily. Frank's jaw tightened. Health insurance. Real insurance. Not the bare-bones catastrophic coverage he currently had. Would mean Lily's asthma medications would be affordable. It would mean regular checkups, preventative care, peace of mind. "And what would this job actually entail?" he asked, still wary. "Initially, helping me understand the challenges families like yours face accessing medications, building a framework for the new division, reviewing pricing structures, patient assistance programs." Alexandra leaned forward, her voice intensifying. "Eventually becoming a voice for patients in every major decision the company makes." Frank shook his head, overwhelmed. "You don't know anything about me. I could be completely unqualified. I don't have a college degree. I've never worked in an office. You have real-world experience that's worth more than an MBA, Alexandra interrupted. "And frankly, your perspective is exactly what my company has been missing. The education, the office skills, those can be learned. Integrity and understanding can't." Lily had finished studying the dessert menu and tugged at her father's sleeve. "Dad, they have tiramisu. Remember when Garcia made that for Christmas last year? It was so good." Frank smiled at his daughter. "Yes, it was pretty amazing." "Can I have some?" Lily asked hopefully. Before Frank could respond, Alexandra signaled the waiter. "3 tiramisus, please." Lily beamed, then excused herself to visit the restroom. Once she was out of earshot, Frank turned back to Alexandra. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked bluntly. "Is it guilt? Charity? Some kind of corporate social responsibility project you can showcase in your annual report?" Alexandra considered the question carefully. "Partly guilt, yes," she admitted. "I've been complicit in a system that puts profits over people. But it's more than that." She hesitated, then continued with unexpected vulnerability. "My father would be ashamed of what the company has become under my leadership. Today, when I saw you give that money to Ruth, I realized I'd forgotten what it means to actually help people." Frank studied her, searching for signs of insincerity but finding none. "And if I say no, then I'll respect your decision," Alexandra replied. "But I'll still move forward with changing our approach to pricing and accessibility. Your insight would make that process more effective, but my commitment doesn't depend on your participation," Lily returned, sliding back into her seat just as the desserts arrived. Her eyes widened at the perfect layers of mascarpone, coffee-soaked ladyfingers, and cocoa. "This looks amazing," she exclaimed, carefully taking her first bite. Her expression of pure delight made both adults smile. "Reeves," Alexandra said quietly while Lily was distracted by her dessert. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. Take some time to think it over." She slid a business card across the table. "My personal number's on the back. Call me when you've made a decision, whatever that may be." Frank took the card, turning it over in his fingers. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Alexandra said, her gaze shifting to Lily, "I'm going to instruct our patient assistance program to review all applications for our asthma medication. Starting tomorrow, no child will be denied treatment because of cost." She paused. "That's happening regardless of your decision." For the first time that evening, Frank's expression softened. "That's a good start." When dinner was finished, Alexandra's driver took them back to their apartment. As they pulled up to the building, Lily, drowsy from the full meal, leaned over to whisper in her father's ear. "Dad, I really like her," she said, nodding toward Alexandra. "She seems sad sometimes, like you do, but nice sad, you know?" Frank squeezed his daughter's hand, once again amazed by her perception. "Get your backpack, honey. It's past your bedtime." As they exited the car, Alexandra rolled down her window. "Thank you for joining me tonight, both of you." Lily waved. "Thank you for the tiramisu. It was even better than Garcia's. But don't tell her I said that." Alexandra laughed, a genuine sound that surprised even her. "Your secret is safe with me." Frank lingered by the car after Lily stepped away. "I'll think about your offer," he said, "but I need to be clear about something. If I take this job, it won't be because I need charity. It'll be because I believe it can make a difference for families like mine. I would expect nothing less, Alexandra replied with newfound respect. Good night, Mr. Reeves. As the car pulled away, Frank stood watching until its taillights disappeared around a corner. In his pocket, Alexandra's business card felt impossibly heavy, a small rectangle of expensive cardstock that represented a choice he'd never imagined having to make. Upstairs, as he tucked Lily into bed, she yawned and asked, "Are we going to see Miss Alexandra again?" Frank smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "I don't know, sweetheart. Maybe. I hope so," Lily murmured, already drifting off. "She looked at you the way you look at me when I do something good." Long after Lily had fallen asleep, Frank sat at their small kitchen table, Alexandra's card propped against a salt shaker. Considering what his daughter had observed and what it might mean for their future, Frank spent 3 days turning Alexandra's offer over in his mind. During his shifts, as he methodically swept the city streets, he tried to imagine himself in a corporate office wearing a suit, speaking in meetings where his words might actually matter. The image was so incongruous that he nearly laughed out loud several times, earning curious looks from passers-by. But at night, watching Lily use her inhaler, the one that had cost nearly a week's pay, the proposition didn't seem so absurd. If he could help make medications more affordable for families like his, wasn't that worth stepping far outside his comfort zone? On Wednesday evening, Mike stopped him as he was clocking out. "Reeves, got a minute?" Frank nodded, following his supervisor to the small office. "Got another call about you," Mike said, his expression unreadable. "From the mayor's office this time?" "The mayor?" Frank's stomach dropped. Had Alexandra escalated this somehow? Was he in trouble? "Yeah, apparently someone's been talking you up in high place." Mike slid a letter across the desk. "City Employee Recognition Award. They're giving it to you at the ceremony next month." Frank stared at the official letterhead in disbelief. "For what?" "Exemplary citizenship and compassion beyond the call of duty," Mike quoted, raising an eyebrow. "Something you want to tell me about, Reeves?" "I honestly have no idea," Frank replied, though he suspected Alexandra was behind. It felt like a calculated move, raising his profile, making him more appealing as a potential spokesperson. The thought irritated him more than it flattered him. "Well, whatever you did, keep it up. Makes the whole department look good." Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "By the way, that Harrington woman called again. Asked me to give you this." He handed Frank an envelope. Inside was a simple note card with Alexandra's elegant handwriting. Asterisk, Mr. Reeves, I understand you need time to consider my offer. In the meantime, I wanted to share that our patient assistance program has already approved 142 applications for asthma medication assistance since Monday. Small steps, but in the right direction. Alexandra asterisk below her signature was a phone number with a star beside it, not her office line, but what appeared to be her personal cell. Frank tucked the note into his pocket, his resolve wavering. She was actually doing what she'd promised, regardless of his decision. That meant something. At home, he found Lily sitting with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, working on a science project about air pollution, ironically, the very thing that often triggered her asthma attacks. "Dad!" Lily exclaimed when he entered. "Mrs. Garcia is helping me build a model that shows how pollution affects different parts of the lungs. It's so cool." Frank smiled, greeting Miss Garcia with gratitude. She had become a surrogate grandmother to Lily since Rachel's death, often watching her when Frank's shifts ran late. "It's no trouble," the elderly woman insisted when Frank thanked her. "Lily's mind is like a sponge. She asked me questions about the respiratory system that had me digging out my old nursing textbooks." After Miss Garcia left, Frank helped Lily finish her homework, marveling again at her quick intelligence and insatiable curiosity. In another life, one where money wasn't a constant worry, who might she become? A doctor, a scientist, a researcher finding cures for diseases like the one that took her mother? As Lily brushed her teeth before bed, Frank found himself staring at Alexandra's note again. The decision wasn't just about him, it was about the doors it might open for his daughter. "You've been extra quiet tonight," Lily observed as he tucked her in. "Is everything okay?" Frank smiled, sometimes forgetting how perceptive she was. "Just thinking about some grown-up stuff. Nothing for you to worry about." Lily studied his face in that serious way she'd inherited from her mother. "Is it about Miss Alexandra and her job offer?" Frank blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" "I wasn't really asleep in the car that night," Lily admitted, "and the walls in the restaurant bathroom were thin. I heard you talking while I was washing my hands." Frank sighed, sitting on the edge of her bed. "What do you think I should do?" Lily considered the question with adorable gravity. "Well, you always tell me that helping people is the most important thing a person can do. And it sounds like at M's Alexandra's company, you could help lots of people, not just one street at a time." The wisdom from his 8-year-old daughter left Frank momentarily speechless. But Lily continued, "I also think you like being outside and moving around. Offices seem boring. Maybe you could do both?" Frank laughed softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Maybe I could, sweet pea. Get some sleep now, single quotes. After Lily drifted off, Frank finally made up his mind. He took out his phone and dialed the personal number Alexandra had provided. She answered on the second ring. "Alexandra Herring." "It's Frank Reeves," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. "About your offer, yes?" There was a note of hopeful anticipation in her voice. "I'll consider it, but I have conditions." There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "I should have expected nothing less." "What are your conditions, Mr. Reeves?" "First, no more publicity stunts like that city award. I don't want to be your charity case or poster child." "Fair enough," Alexandra conceded, "though for the record, I only suggested your name. The mayor's office made the final decision." "Second," Frank continued, I stay in my current job while consulting for you part-time. I need to see if this is a good fit before I give up steady work. Absolutely reasonable. Third, Frank's voice grew firmer. Any changes we implement have to be real and sustainable, not just PR moves to make your company look good. I won't be part of something that's just for show. That's exactly why I want you, Mr. Reeves, Alexandra replied, sincerity evident in her tone. Your integrity is the point. Frank took a deep breath before stating his final condition. And last, I want an educational trust set up for Lily. Not as payment for my services. You can pay me a fair consulting fee separately, but as your personal commitment to the next generation. A child's potential shouldn't be limited by their parents' financial circumstances. The line went quiet for a moment. That's quite specific, Alexandra finally said. May I ask why? Frank glanced toward Lily's bedroom. Because my daughter deserves a future where she can be anything she wants to be, not just what our budget allows. And because if you're serious about changing your company's approach to healthcare, investing in the education of someone who might someday develop better, more affordable treatment seems like good business sense. Another pause. Then I can have the paperwork for all of this drawn up by tomorrow afternoon. Would you be available to meet at my office around 4? I finish my shift at 3, Frank replied. I'll need time to pick up Lily from school first. Bring her, Alexandra suggested. I'd like her to be part of this conversation. After all, as you've just made clear, her future is a key component. After hanging up, Frank felt a strange mixture of trepidation and hope. He was stepping into unknown territory, but with his eyes wide open and his terms clearly stated. If Alexandra was sincere about making changes, perhaps this unlikely partnership could work after all. The following afternoon, Frank found himself standing in the gleaming lobby of Harrington Pharmaceuticals headquarters, still in his street clothes, holding Lily's hand. The receptionist eyed them curiously, but directed them to the executive elevator with professional courtesy. This place is huge, Lily whispered, her eyes wide as they ascended to the top floor. Do you think they have a laboratory with scientists and everything? I'm sure they do. Somewhere in the building, Frank replied, adjusting his collar nervously. The elevator doors opened directly into a reception area where a polished young woman greeted them with a warm smile. Mr. Reeves and Lily? Miss Harrington is expecting you. Please follow me. They were led through a series of elegant corridors to a large corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Alexandra rose from behind a massive desk to greet them, dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Frank's monthly rent, but her smile seemed genuine. Thank you both for coming, she said, shaking Frank's hand and then kneeling slightly to address Lily at eye level. I'm especially glad you could join us, Lily. I've arranged a little tour of our research and development department for you while your dad and I talk business. Would you like that? Lily's eyes lit up. Real scientists? Really? Really, Alexandra confirmed. In fact, Dr. Chun, who heads our pediatric respiratory research team, is waiting to show you around. She was very excited to meet the young lady who created a working water filtration system for her science project. Frank shot Alexandra a questioning look. You mentioned it during dinner, she explained. I thought Lily might enjoy seeing how her interest in science could translate to a career someday. As a young research assistant arrived to escort an ecstatic Lily to the labs, Frank felt a newfound respect for Alexandra. She wasn't just going through the motions, she had listened and thoughtfully included his daughter in a meaningful way. Once they were alone, Alexandra gestured to a comfortable seating area where a folder of documents waited on the coffee table. I've had legal draft everything according to your conditions, she said, taking a seat across from him. The educational trust for Lily, the consulting arrangement while you maintain your current job, and a clear mandate for the patient advocacy division with measurable benchmarks for success. Frank picked up the folder, skepticism still not entirely erased. Why are you really doing this, Alexandra? A chance encounter on the street doesn't normally lead to this kind of transformation. Alexandra's professional demeanor faltered slightly. Do you remember the homeless woman you helped? Ruth. Frank nodded. I found her at the pharmacy, as I mentioned. But what I didn't tell you is what she said about you. Alexandra's voice softened. She told me that in 30 years of living on the streets, you were the first person who looked her in the eye and treated her like a human being, not a problem to avoid. She said, that man has nothing, but he still saw me when no one else would. Alexandra looked out at the city where thousands of lives intersected daily. I realized I've spent 5 years running a company that makes products to save lives, without ever really seeing the people whose lives we're meant to be saving. You showed me what I've been missing, Mr. Reeves, and I can't unsee it now. 6 weeks later, Frank found himself in the unusual position of having two completely different work uniforms hanging in his closet, the faded orange coveralls of the city's street maintenance department, and a charcoal gray suit that Alexandra had insisted on having tailored for him when it became clear his consulting role would include attending executive meeting. Presentation matters in those rooms, she had explained when he'd protested the expense. Not because you need to impress anyone, but because you need them to listen. Fair or not, appearance affects how seriously people take your words. Frank had reluctantly agreed, though he still felt like an imposter every time he put the suit on. Today was one of those days, his first official board presentation as the patient advocacy consultant for Harrington Pharmaceuticals. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror of the small bathroom, Lily poked her head around the door. You look handsome, Dad. she said with approval. Like the dads on TV shows. Frank laughed, though his stomach was churning with anxiety. Thanks, sweet pea. I feel like I'm wearing a costume. It's not a costume, Lily replied with 8-year-old wisdom. It's just different clothes for a different job, like how I wear my soccer uniform for games, but regular clothes for school. Frank smiled at the comparison. When did you get so smart? I was born this way, she quipped, skipping off to finish her breakfast. The past 6 weeks had been a whirlwind of changes. Frank still worked his regular shift, cleaning the streets from 5 a.m. until 1 p.m., but 3 afternoons a week he traded his broom for a briefcase and headed to Harrington headquarters. Alexandra had arranged his consulting hours to coincide with Lily's school schedule, so he rarely needed childcare. His initial assignment had been simple but crucial: review every patient assistance program the company offered and identify the gaps, the excessive paperwork, the unnecessary hurdles. Having navigated these systems as a parent, Frank brought a perspective the executives had never considered. It took me 4 hours and 3 phone calls to complete this application, he had said in his first meeting, holding up the form for their asthma medication program. I have a high school education and speak English as my first language. Imagine trying to do this if neither of those things were true. His blunt assessments had made some executives uncomfortable, but Alexandra had backed him completely, implementing his suggested changes with remarkable speed. The simplified application process had already increased program enrollment by 37% in just a month. Today's presentation was different, though. Today he would be recommending a complete overhaul of their pricing structure for life-saving medications, a proposal that would significantly impact profit margin and likely face serious resistance from the board. Mrs. Garcia arrived to walk Lily to school, giving Frank a reassuring pat on the arm. You'll do wonderfully, she said, somehow intuiting his nerves. Just speak your truth. That's all any of us can do. The drive to Harrington Pharmaceuticals felt both longer and shorter than usual. Frank rehearsed his talking points, trying to anticipate objections, steeling himself for the skepticism he would face. His proposal was radical by industry standards, a tiered pricing system based on ability to pay rather than maximum market value. Alexandra met him in the lobby, her professional demeanor briefly softening into a smile when she saw him. Ready for this? She asked as they walked toward the elevator. As ready as I'll ever be, Frank replied, adjusting his tie again nervously. The data supports your proposal, Alexandra reminded him, and I've been preparing the board for weeks. They know changes are coming. Frank nodded, though he wasn't convinced it would be that simple. In his brief exposure to corporate culture, he'd already learned that profit was a powerful motivator, and his plan directly challenged the company's traditional approach to maximizing returns. The boardroom was intimidating. A long polished table surrounded by stern-faced executives in expensive suits. Frank took his assigned seat near Alexandra at the head of the table, acutely aware of the curious and sometimes dismissive glances cast his way. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexandra began, as you know, over the past month, Mr. Reeves has been conducting a comprehensive review of our pricing structures and accessibility programs. His findings and recommendations are outlined in the packets before you. Frank, would you walk us through the proposal? Frank stood, momentarily freezing as every eye in the room turned to him. For a fleeting second, he was transported back to his 5th grade class. He'd been asked to present a book report and had stammered his way through it, face burning with embarrassment. But then he thought of Lily, of her unshakable belief in him, of Ruth, who had needed medication she couldn't afford, of the countless others like them. This wasn't about him or his discomfort. It was about them. Thank you, Miss Harrington, he began, his voice steadier than he expected. I'm not going to pretend I understand all the financial complexities of running a pharmaceutical company. I don't have an MBA or a background in corporate finance. What I do have is experience. 7 years of choosing between medication for my daughter and other necessities. He made eye contact with several board members, refusing to be intimidated by their skeptical expressions. The proposal before you is simple in concept, though I understand the implementation will be complex. We're suggesting a tiered pricing model for life-saving and chronic disease medications, one that reflects ability to pay rather than what the market will bear. An older man at the far end of the table cleared his throat. Mr. Reeves, while your personal perspective is certainly interesting, our fiduciary duty is to our shareholders. This proposal would reduce our profit margins by an estimated 22% in the first year alone. Frank had anticipated this argument. Yes, it would, he acknowledged. In the short term, but I'd like to direct your attention to page 7, where we've projected the long-term impact. The board members flipped to the indicated page, where Alexandra's financial team had calculated the potential benefits of the new model: increased volume through greater accessibility, improved public perception leading to brand loyalty, reduced costs from streamlined assistance programs, and tax benefits from the restructured charitable component. More importantly, Frank continued, I'd like you to consider what business you're actually in. Is Harrington Pharmaceuticals in the business of maximizing shareholder value at any cost, or is it in the business of improving and saving lives through accessible medication? The room fell silent. Alexandra watched the faces around the table, some thoughtful, others defensive. That's a false dichotomy, another executive argued. We can do both. Exactly my point, Frank replied, surprising them with his agreement. This proposal isn't about choosing between profit and purpose, it's about aligning them. It's about sustainable profit that doesn't come at the expense of the very people your medications are meant to help. For the next hour, Frank fielded questions, navigated objection, and explained the human impact of their current pricing model. He shared anonymized stories from families he'd interviewed, parents who rationed their own medication to afford their children's elderly patients choosing between medicine and food, young adults hospitalized because they couldn't afford maintenance medications. By the time the meeting concluded, Frank was exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The board hadn't immediately rejected the proposal. Instead, they'd established a committee to study its implementation with Frank as a key consultant. It wasn't complete acceptance, but it was a start. You were remarkable in there, Alexandra told him as they left the boardroom. You spoke their language while never letting them forget the human element. Frank loosened his tie, feeling like he could finally breathe again. I was terrified the whole time. It didn't show, she assured him. But what did show was your passion and your integrity. They're rare qualities in these circles. They walked to her office, where Frank collapsed into a chair, suddenly aware of how drained he felt. There's something else I wanted to discuss with you, Alexandra said, taking a seat across from him rather than behind her desk. I've been thinking about your dual roles, city employee in the mornings, pharmaceutical consultant in the afternoons. It's not sustainable long term. Frank tensed. I'm managing it fine. You're exhausting yourself, Alexandra countered gently. And while your street cleaning work is honorable, your impact there is limited. Here you're helping to reshape an entire industry's approach to healthcare access. Are you offering me a full-time position? Frank asked directly. Yes, as Director of Patient Advocacy, reporting directly to me. Full benefits, salary commensurate with other department heads, and complete authority over the initiatives we've been developing. Frank stared out the window at the city below. Somewhere down there were the streets he'd cleaned for 7 years, the sidewalks he'd swept in the pre-dawn hours, the routine that had defined his days since Rachel's death. I'd need to think about it, he said finally. This isn't just about a job change for me. It's about identity, who I am, who Lily sees me as. Alexandra nodded, understanding in her eyes. Take all the time you need. The offer stands. As Frank left her office, his phone buzzed with a text from Lily's school. His heart stopped when he read the message. Lily having asthma attack. Administered emergency inhaler. Please come immediately. His world narrowed to a single point of focus. Everything else, the board meeting, the job offer, the suit he was wearing, vanished from his mind. He rushed to the elevator, fumbling with his phone to call a taxi. Alexandra emerged from her office, alarmed by his sudden panic. Frank, what's wrong? Lily, he managed to say, showing her the text. I need to get to her school, now. Without hesitation, Alexandra grabbed her keys. My car's in the garage. I'll drive you myself, as they raced through the city streets. Frank stared out the window, his mind a tornado of worry. The proposal he'd just defended, the potential full-time position, none of it mattered if Lily wasn't okay. In that moment of crisis, he was reminded of what had always been his core truth. Being Lily's father was the most important job he would ever have. Alexandra's luxury sedan weaved through traffic with surprising agility, her normally composed demeanor replaced by fierce determination. Frank sat rigid in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming anxiously against his thigh, watching the distance to Lily's school shrink on the navigation screen. We're 5 minutes out, Alexandra said, catching his eye briefly. She's going to be fine. The school administered her emergency inhaler. Frank nodded stiffly, though the reassurance did little to calm him. Every asthma attack brought back the helpless terror of the first major episode 3 years ago. Lily's tiny body struggling for air, her lips turning a faint blue, the paramedics working with practiced efficiency as he stood by, utterly powerless. Last time, he said, his voice barely audible, it was triggered by the pollen count. But it's October, understand? ... Could be anything, Alexandra replied gently. Stress, a cold coming on, dust from construction near the school. Frank squeezed his eyes shut. I should have been there. Not in some boardroom talking about theoretical patients when my own daughter... Stop, Alexandra interrupted firmly. You were doing exactly what a good father does. Working to create a better world for your child. You can't be everywhere at once, Frank. Before he could respond, they pulled up to the school entrance. Frank was out of the car before it fully stopped, rushing toward the building with Alexandra following close behind. The school nurse's office was a small, sterile room with bright posters about hand washing and healthy eating. Lily sat on an examination bed, her face pale but her breathing steady. The school nurse stood beside her, clipboard in hand. Relief washed over Frank as he entered, and Lily's face lit up at the sight of him. Dad, she exclaimed, her voice slightly raspy but strong. You're wearing your suit. Frank crossed the room in 3 strides, gathering her into a tight hug. How are you feeling, sweet pea? What happened? The nurse, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, stepped forward. She's doing much better, Mr. Reeves. The attack was moderate. We administered the emergency inhaler immediately, and her breathing stabilized within minutes. Do you know what triggered it? Frank asked, his arm still protectively around Lily's shoulders. The nurse glanced down at her notes. We were having an outdoor science lesson about local plant life. One of the samples brought in was ragweed. I believe that may have been the culprit. Lily nodded. My chest got all tight and wheezy as soon as Jimmy opened the bag with the plants. I'd like to take her home, Frank said, already gathering Lily's backpack. Of course, the nurse agreed. I've made a note in her file about the ragweed sensitivity. We'll be more careful with plant samples in the future. Only then did the nurse notice Alexandra standing quietly by the door. Her eyes widened slightly in recognition. Alexandra Harrington was a prominent figure in the city's business, her face occasionally appearing in the local. I'm sorry, the nurse said, clearly confused. Are you ... a family friend? Alexandra supplied smoothly. I was meeting with Mr. Reeves when the school called. Frank turned to Alexandra, suddenly remembering their abrupt departure from Harrington headquarters. I'm sorry about rushing out like that. Your meeting schedule is completely irrelevant right now, Alexandra finished for him. Do you need a ride home? Frank hesitated, looking at Lily. Her color was returning, but she still appeared drained from the episode. That would be helpful, thank you. The ride to their apartment was quiet, Lily dozing against her father's shoulder in the back seat. Alexandra drove more sedately now, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at the father and daughter. You must think I'm overreacting, Frank said softly, meeting her eyes in the mirror. Alexandra shook her head. Not at all. I think you're being a parent. Her mother died from complications after pneumonia, Frank explained, his voice low to avoid waking Lily. Her lungs were always weak from childhood asthma. Every time Lily has an attack, I can't help but think ... Single quotes, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. I understand, Alexandra replied, and something in her tone made Frank believe she genuinely did. When they arrived at the apartment building, Alexandra insisted on helping Frank get Lily settled. She carried the little girl's backpack while Frank carried Lily herself. Now fully asleep, her head nestled against his shoulder. The apartment was modest but meticulously maintained, clean, organized, with Lily's artwork proudly displayed on the walls. Alexandra took in the details silently as Frank gently laid Lily on her bed and removed her shoes. Can I get you anything? Alexandra asked when they returned to the small living room. Tea? Water? Frank ran a hand through his hair, still processing the afternoon's events. I'm fine. Thank you for everything today. The ride, the help. I should let you get back to work. Work can wait, Alexandra said, settling onto the couch as if making a deliberate statement. I'd like to stay if that's all right, at least until Lily wakes up and we can see how she's feeling. Frank studied her, this powerful executive who had driven like a rally car racer to get his daughter to safety, who now sat in his humble apartment offering quiet support. It was disarming, this glimpse of the person behind the corporate title. Why do you care so much? He asked finally, the question that had been gnawing at him since their first encounter. About us, I mean. You barely know us. Alexandra was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to Lily's bedroom door. My sister had asthma, she said finally. Severe asthma like your wife. She died when I was 16. We couldn't afford the treatments that might have helped her. Frank's expression softened in understanding. I'm sorry. I didn't know. It's not something I talk about, Alexandra replied. It was a different time, before patient assistance programs, before the ACA. My father started Harrington Pharmaceuticals later, driven by the loss. And now you run the company, Frank observed. Yes, my father believed in accessible medication for all. Somewhere along the way, under pressure from shareholders and the board, I lost sight of that mission. She met his eyes directly, until I saw you give your last $20 to Ruth. Frank moved to the kitchen, needing a moment to absorb this revelation. I'm making tea after all, he announced. Would you like some? Alexandra nodded, and they fell into a companionable silence as Frank prepared 2 mugs. The domestic normalcy of the act, making tea in his own kitchen while a billionaire pharmaceutical CEO sat on his worn couch, struck him as surreal. When he returned with the mugs, Alexandra had removed her suit jacket and kicked off her heels, looking more human than he'd ever seen her. What you said in the boardroom today was important, she said, accepting the tea gratefully. Not just the proposal, but the perspective. You reminded everyone why the company exists in the first place, to help people live better, healthier lives. Frank settled into the armchair across from her. Did it make a difference, though? Really? Those executives weren't exactly rushing to embrace reduced profit margins. Change takes time, Alexandra admitted, but it's happening. The committee formed today isn't just for show. I've selected members who understand the vision. Frank took a sip of his tea, wincing slightly at the heat. I meant what I said about needing time to consider your full-time offer. My street cleaning job, ... It's honest work, important work. The city needs clean streets. It does, Alexandra agreed. But the world also needs people who can see both sides of a broken system and have the courage to build bridges across it. She leaned forward. What happened today with Lily? That's exactly why this work matters. No parent should have to choose between medication and rent, between an inhaler and food. From the bedroom came a soft call. Dad? Frank immediately set down his mug and went to check on Lily. He returned a moment later, his daughter following sleepily behind him, her hair mussed from her nap. Ms. Alexandra? Lily said, surprised to see their visitor. You're still here. I wanted to make sure you were feeling better, Alexandra replied with a warm smile. Lily nodded, climbing onto the couch beside her. I'm okay now, just tired and hungry. Frank chuckled. That's a good sign. How about some soup? While Frank heated chicken soup in the kitchen, he listened to the soft conversation between Lily and Alexandra. His daughter was asking about the scientists she'd met during her tour of Harrington Pharmaceuticals. her natural curiosity undimmed by the day's scare. Dr. Chun said I could email her questions about respiratory research, Lily was saying, excited. She's working on a new kind of inhaler that lasts longer and works faster. She's one of our best researchers, Alexandra confirmed. And she was very impressed by your questions. As Frank carried bowls of soup to the living room, he was struck by the tableau before him. His daughter animatedly discussing scientific research with a CEO who was listening with genuine interest and respect. In that moment, he saw a glimpse of what Lily's future could hold with the right opportunities, the right mentors, the right doors open for her. Maybe Alexandra was right. Maybe his impact could be greater in a corporate boardroom than on city streets. It's not because street cleaning wasn't valuable work, but because his unique perspective as a working-class single father, as a patient's caregiver, as someone who had given his last $20 to a stranger in need, was desperately needed in the rooms where healthcare decisions were made. As they ate their soup together, the afternoon's crisis receding, Frank made his decision. He would accept Alexandra's offer, not for himself, but for Lily, and for all the other Lilies out there whose parents were making impossible choices between medicine and necessities. Sometimes the greatest act of compassion wasn't giving $20 to one person in need, but changing a system that created that need in the first place. 3 months into his new role as Director of Patient Advocacy at Harrington Pharmaceuticals, Frank still occasionally felt like an imposter. The executive parking space with his name on it, the corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, the assistant who scheduled his meetings and brought him coffee, all of it seemed to belong to someone else's life, a movie he'd somehow wandered into by accident. But then there were moments when he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Today was one of those moments. Frank stood in the company's main conference room addressing a group of pharmaceutical executives from across the industry. Alexandra had organized the summit to showcase Harrington's new patient-centered approach, hoping to inspire or perhaps pressure other companies to follow their lead. The tiered pricing model we implemented 8 weeks ago has already shown promising results, Frank explained, pointing to the data projected on the screen behind him. Patient access has increased by 48% for our most critical medications, while revenue has decreased by only 13%, significantly less than the 22% our financial team initially projected. He clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the United States dotted with colored pins. These markers represent patients who previously rationed their medications due to cost, but are now able to follow their prescribed regimens properly. This isn't just a humanitarian success, it's a public health win that reduces emergency room visits, hospitalizations, and complications. Frank no longer felt nervous addressing these rooms full of power and privilege. His confidence had grown not from acclimatizing to their world, but from the conviction that he was bringing his world, the reality of ordinary people, into theirs. What about shareholder concerns? Asked the CEO of a rival company, his tone skeptical. Our board would never approve such a dramatic restructuring. Frank exchanged a glance with Alexandra, who nodded slightly, giving him the floor to respond as he saw fit. Our shareholders were initially concerned as well, Frank acknowledged, but we've implemented transparency measures that have actually increased investor confidence. We publish monthly impact reports alongside our financial statements, demonstrating the human benefit of each decision. He paused, then decided to take a more direct approach. I'd also suggest that if your board is more concerned with quarterly profits than with fulfilling your company's mission to improve health outcomes, perhaps it's time to reassess who's sitting at that table. A murmur ran through the room, some uncomfortable, some appreciative. Alexandra hid a smile behind her hand. In 3 months, Frank had never learned to sugarcoat his assessments, and she had stopped expecting him to. His blunt honesty was precisely his value. After the meeting concluded, Alexandra found Frank in his office reviewing applications for the company's expanded patient assistance program. He made quite an impression on some very powerful people today, she said, leaning against his doorframe. Peterson from Novacorp cornered me afterward to ask where I'd found you. Frank looked up, a wry smile playing at his lips. What did you tell him? The truth, Alexandra replied, that you gave your last $20 to a homeless woman, and it changed everything. Frank shook his head, still uncomfortable with the way that moment had been elevated to something mythical. It wasn't that extraordinary, but it was, Alexandra insisted, entering his office and taking a seat. Most people wouldn't have done it. I certainly wouldn't have before ... Single quotes before what? Frank asked when she didn't continue. Alexandra considered the question. Before I saw someone whose moral compass was stronger than his circumstances. It made me question my own. An alert on Frank's phone interrupted the moment. A reminder for Lily's school presentation that afternoon. I need to leave by 3, he said. Lily's presenting her science project today. The one Dr. Chun helped her develop. I remember, Alexandra said. The air quality monitor, right? That's become quite the passion project for her. Frank nodded proudly. She's been testing it in different neighborhoods, comparing readings. She's already talking about expanding it next year to include pollen and allergen detection. She's remarkable, Alexandra said with genuine admiration. Would you mind if I attended her presentation? I'd love to see the final project. Frank blinked in surprise. You want to come to an elementary school science presentation? Only if it's appropriate, Alexandra backtracked. I don't want to intrude on a family moment. Frank studied her, recognizing something beneath her professional composure, a simple human desire to be included, to be part of something meaningful outside corporate success. Lily would be thrilled, he said finally. She's been talking about her friend Ms. Alexandra to everyone who listened. The transformation on Alexandra's face was subtle but unmistakable, a softening around the eyes, a warmth that had nothing to do with business achievements or corporate status. Thank you, she said simply. I'll have my driver meet us downstairs at 3. Later that afternoon, sitting in child-sized chairs in Lily's classroom, Frank watched his daughter present her air quality monitoring system with confidence and enthusiasm. Her teacher had paired her with 2 other students for the larger project, but it was clear from the presentation that Lily had been the driving force behind their work. Our data shows that air quality is worse in neighborhoods with more traffic and fewer trees, Lily explained, pointing to a colorful graph. And the worst air quality is in areas where more people have breathing problems like asthma. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a map of the city with color-coded zones. This isn't a coincidence. Bad air makes asthma worse, and people who can't afford to live in neighborhoods with better air get sicker. Frank felt a swell of pride mixed with poignancy. At 8 years old, his daughter already understood the inequities of the world with a clarity that most adults never achieve. Our conclusion, Lily continued, is that clean air shouldn't just be for people who can afford it. Everyone deserves to breathe without getting sick. When the presentation ended, the classroom erupted in applause. Lily's teacher awarded their group first place, praising the project's real-world application and social consciousness. As the students were dismissed, Lily ran to Frank and Alexandra, her face flushed with excitement. Did you like it? Was it okay? I was so nervous when the graph wouldn't load at first. The words tumbled out in a rush. It was more than okay, Frank assured her, kneeling to her level. It was brilliant, sweet pea. I'm so proud of you. Your research methodology was excellent, Alexandra added, sounding both professional and genuinely impressed. The correlation between socioeconomic factors and air quality is something many adult researchers struggle to document so clearly. Lily beamed at the specific praise. Dr. Chun helped me design the testing protocol. She says I have natural scientific instincts. She's absolutely right, Alexandra. In fact, single quote, she hesitated, glancing at Frank for permission before continuing. Harrington has a summer science program for middle and high school students, but I think we might need to create a junior division. Would you be interested in being our first participant? Lily's eyes widened to saucers. A real science program? With lab coats and everything? With lab coats and everything, Alexandra confirmed, smiling at the child's excitement. As they left the school, Frank hanging back slightly to speak with Lily's teacher, Alexandra felt a small hand slip into hers. She looked down to find Lily walking beside her, holding her hand as naturally as if they did this every day. Thank you for coming to my presentation, Lily said, swinging their joined hands slightly. Dad says you're a very busy, important person, so it means a lot that you made time. The simple gratitude caught Alexandra off guard, a lump forming unexpectedly in her throat. I wouldn't have missed it, she managed to reply. Your work is important too. Lily considered this seriously. Dad says that's what you taught him, that everybody's work is important if it helps other people. Alexandra was startled by this characterization. Your dad said I taught him that? Hung? He says you could just focus on making money, but instead you care about making medicine that people can actually afford. Lily looked up at her with those earnest eyes that missed nothing. He says that's real success. The idea that Frank spoke about her this way to his daughter with respect and appreciation rather than resentment for the power imbalance between them was unexpectedly moving. Alexandra had grown accustomed to being feared, envied, or resented for her position. Genuine respect based on her character rather than her authority was rarer than she cared to admit. Frank rejoined them, smiling at the sight of his daughter chatting comfortably with the CEO. Everything okay here? Ms. Alexandra is taking us for ice cream to celebrate, Lily announced. Frank raised an eyebrow. Is she now? Alexandra looked momentarily flustered. I hope that's all right. Lily mentioned wanting ice cream and I thought, it's perfectly all right, Frank assured her, amused by this rare glimpse of uncertainty from the usually decisive executive. Though I think someone should have checked with her father first, he added with a pointed but gentle look at his daughter. Lily had the grace to look slightly chagrined. Sorry, Dad. Can we go for ice cream with Ms. Alexandra? Please? I suppose we can, Frank relented with mock severity. If Miss Alexandra doesn't have more important CEO things to do. Alexandra checked her watch and then deliberately silenced her phone before slipping it into her purse. Nothing more important than celebrating scientific excellence, she declared. Ice cream is clearly the priority. As they walked toward the neighborhood ice cream parlor, Alexandra found herself sandwiched between Frank and Lily, the little girl still holding her hand while chattering about future research plans. The scene was so far removed from her normal existence of board meetings and shareholder calls that it felt almost surreal. Yet somehow, it also felt more authentic than anything she'd experienced in years. Here she wasn't being evaluated on quarterly earnings or market share. She was simply a person spending time with another person and his remarkable child, celebrating a moment of genuine achievement. It struck Alexandra that this, not the corner office or the executive perks or the power to make multi-million-dollar decisions, might be what real success felt like after all. 6 months after Frank had given his last $20 to Ruth, his life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The street sweeper's uniform hung in the back of his closet now, a reminder of the path that had led him here. His new role at Harrington Pharmaceuticals had expanded beyond patient advocacy to include overseeing a complete restructuring of their community engagement and corporate social responsibility initiatives. The pharmaceutical industry had taken notice. What had begun as a small-scale experiment in pricing reform at one company was sparking industry-wide conversations. 3 other major pharmaceutical manufacturers had adopted modified versions of Frank's tiered pricing model. Healthcare advocacy groups were celebrating the change, while financial analysts debated the long-term sustainability of the approach. Through it all, Frank maintained the straightforward, unpolished honesty that had gotten him hired in the first place. He refused to adopt corporate jargon or soften his assessments to spare egos. If a policy was harmful to patients, he said so directly, regardless of whose pet project it was. "You've disrupted the entire industry," Alexandra told him one evening as they reviewed the quarterly impact report in her office. "The Harrington model is being discussed in business schools." Frank shook his head, still uncomfortable with the attention. "I just pointed out what was obvious to anyone who's ever had to choose between medication and groceries. You're the one who had the courage to implement it." "We make a good team," Alexandra observed. Not for the first time. Their professional partnership had indeed become remarkably effective. Alexandra understood the financial and regulatory complexities of the pharmaceutical industry, while Frank never let her forget the human impact of every decision. They balanced each other, challenging and supporting in equal measure. But it wasn't just their professional relationship that had evolved. Alexandra had become a regular presence in Frank and Lily's lives. Sunday dinners at their apartment, now a modestly upgraded 2-bedroom in a safer neighborhood. Science museum trips with Lily. Even holiday celebrations, Alexandra had joined them for Thanksgiving, bringing an elaborate catered meal that made Lily's eyes widen in delight. Frank found himself watching Alexandra with Lily, noting the natural ease that had developed between them. For someone who had spent her adult life in boardrooms and executive suites, Alexandra showed a surprising capacity for connecting with an 8-year-old. She listened to Lily's elaborate theories and endless questions with genuine interest, never dismissing or patronizing. Today was a milestone, the official launch of the Harrington Patient Access, a comprehensive program that would make life-saving medications available at deeply discounted rates to those who needed them most. The company had organized a press conference to announce the initiative, and Frank was scheduled to speak alongside Alexandra. As Frank adjusted his tie in the mirror of his office bathroom, there was a knock at his door. "Come in," he called, emerging to find Alexandra in the doorway. "Ready for the wolves?" she asked with a slight smile, using their private shorthand for the press. "As ready as I'll ever be," Frank replied, gathering his notes. "Where's Lily?" "Still in the lab with Dr. Chun. They're putting the finishing touches on her science camp presentation for next week." Alexandra checked her watch. "We should go. The auditorium is already filling up." They walked together through the executive corridor, a comfortable silence between them. Just before they reached the auditorium, Alexandra stopped. "Frank," she said, her tone suddenly serious, "before we go out there's something I wanted to discuss with." Frank raised an eyebrow, sensing her unusual tension. "What is it?" The board is extremely pleased with the direction the company has taken," she began. "Our ethical rankings are at an all-time high. Patient goodwill is through the roof, and contrary to all predictions, our stock price has actually increased by 4% since implementing the pricing reforms." "That's good news," Frank said cautiously, unsure where this was heading. Alexandra took a deep breath. "They've offered me the position of chairwoman. The current chairman is retiring and they want a smooth transition." "Alexandra, that's fantastic," Frank exclaimed with genuine enthusiasm. "You deserve it. You've completely transformed this company." "We've transformed it," she corrected, "which is why I told them I'd only accept if they agreed to create a new position. Executive Vice President of Patient Advocacy and Community Impact." Frank's expression shifted from congratulatory to wary. "And let me guess who they have in mind for that role." "You're the obvious choice," Alexandra confirmed. "You've already been doing much of the work. This would formalize your position in the executive leadership structure, with appropriate compensation and authority." Frank leaned against the wall, processing the implications. "Executive Vice President," he repeated, the title sounding foreign on his tongue. "That's a long way from street sweeper." "It's a natural progression from where you are now," Alexandra countered. "Your work deserves recognition, and the position needs the authority to ensure it continues regardless of who's running the company." Frank studied her face. "Is that what this is about? Ensuring your legacy if you move on?" Alexandra's eyes widened slightly. "Move on? I'm not going anywhere, Frank, but corporate leadership changes. That's inevitable. I want to make sure the work we've started continues long after both of us." There was something in her expression, a flicker of emotion beyond professional concern, that caught Frank's attention. Before he could decipher it, the PR director hurried toward them. "5 minutes. M. Harrington, M.R. Reeves. The Secretary of Health and Human Services just arrived, and the press is getting restless." "We'll be right there," Alexandra assured her. She turned back to Frank. "Think about it. We can discuss the details after the announcement." Frank nodded, though uncertainty lingered. The title, the increased responsibility, the further distancing from his former life, it all felt simultaneously thrilling and disorienting. The press conference was a carefully choreographed presentation of the new initiative. Alexandra spoke first, outlining the company's commitment to accessibility and ethical pricing. She was polished and articulate, the perfect corporate face of compassionate capitalism. When Frank's turn came, he set aside his prepared remarks. Instead, he spoke directly about what the initiative would mean for real people, parents who wouldn't have to choose between rent and medication, elderly patients who wouldn't need to cut pills in half to stretch prescriptions, children who would grow up with properly managed conditions instead of undertreated symptoms. 6 months ago, I gave $20 to a homeless woman who needed medicine, Frank said, his voice steady. I did it because in that moment her need was greater than mine. What we're announcing today is built on the same principle, just at a larger scale. We're acknowledging that access to life-saving medication isn't a luxury or a privilege. It's a basic human need. The room was silent when he finished, reporters momentarily forgetting to take notes or photos. Then the questions began, the usual mix of skeptical inquiries about financial impacts and sustainability. One reporter raised her hand. Mr. Reeves, there are rumors that your relationship with Miss Harrington extends beyond professional collaboration. Would you care to comment on that? Frank froze, caught completely off guard. He glanced at Alexandra, whose composed expression revealed nothing of her thoughts. My relationship with Ms. Harrington is based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to reforming healthcare access, Frank replied carefully. Her personal investment in this mission has been inspirational to everyone involved with the initiative, the reporter persisted. You've been seen together outside of work contexts numerous times. Some shareholders are concerned about potential conflicts of interest in the company's new direction. Before Frank could respond, Alexandra stepped to the microphone. Let me address that directly, she said, her voice cool but firm. Mr. Reeves was hired for his unique perspective and integrity. The board has been fully briefed on all aspects of our working relationship and has expressed nothing but support for the direction we're taking the company. As for our personal lives, they remain personal. She moved on to the next question with practiced efficiency, but Frank noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. The question had rattled her more than she wanted to show. After the press conference concluded, they were immediately swept into separate meetings. Frank with patient advocacy groups eager to partner with the initiative, Alexandra with major investors needing reassurance. It wasn't until late evening that Frank found a moment to check his phone. 3 missed calls from Lily's science camp, followed by a text from Alexandra. Lily had a minor asthma episode during lab work. She's fine. I picked her up and she's with me at my place. She didn't want to worry you during the press conference. Frank immediately called Alexandra. She's watching a movie in the guest room, Alexandra assured him before he could ask. Her breathing is completely normal. It was just a precautionary measure because they were working with some chemical compounds. I'll come get her right away, Frank said, already gathering his things. There's no rush, Alexandra replied. She's comfortable and I ordered dinner. Why don't you join us when you finish up? We can discuss the EVP position and ... other thing. The slight hesitation in her voice caught Frank's attention. Other things? He echoed. The reporter's question wasn't entirely unfounded, Alexandra said after a pause. We should probably talk about that too. Frank sat down slowly, the day's events catching up with him all at once. The press conference, the job offer, and now this acknowledgement of the unspoken tension that had been building between them for months. I'll be there in an hour, he said finally. And Alexandra, thank you for being there for Billy. Always, she replied simply, and in that one word, Frank heard the promise of something he hadn't allowed himself to consider until now. A future where he and Lily weren't facing the world alone anymore. 1 year to the day after Frank had given his last $20 to a homeless woman, he stood in the gleaming lobby of Harrington Pharmaceuticals beside Alexandra, preparing to unveil the company's newest initiative. The marble plaque they were about to reveal read, the Ruth Reynolds Memorial Clinic, named for the homeless woman whose encounter with Frank had sparked the transformation of both their lives. It had taken months to find Ruth's full name and history. With Alexandra's resources, they had eventually pieced together her story. A former elementary school teacher whose life had unraveled after a devastating car accident left her with chronic pain, mounting medical bills, and an addiction to prescription painkillers. The healthcare system had failed her at every turn, until she ended up on that street corner where Frank had found her. Are you ready? Alexandra asked softly, her hand brushing against his. Frank nodded, his throat tight with emotion. I just wish we could have found her sooner. They had located Ruth 3 months after their initial encounter, but it was too late. Years of untreated medical conditions and harsh living conditions had taken their toll. She had died in a county hospital, alone but for a kind nurse who had held her hand in her final hours. She won't be forgotten, Alexandra. Her name will be on a place of healing. The Ruth Reynolds Memorial Clinic represented everything they had worked toward over the past year, a comprehensive healthcare center that would provide free medical services to the homeless and underinsured, funded entirely by Harrington Pharmaceuticals' new Community Impact Division. The audience gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony was a striking mix of corporate executives, medical professionals, community advocates, and current and former homeless individuals who would benefit from the clinic's services. Frank had insisted on this inclusive guest list, reminding everyone involved that the clinic's purpose was to bridge gaps, not reinforce them. As the ceremony began, Frank stepped to the microphone, still somewhat uncomfortable with public speaking, but driven by conviction. "A year ago today, I gave $20 to a woman named Ruth Reynolds," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't know her name then. She was just a person who needed help, and I had something to give, even if it wasn't much. But what I didn't realize was that someone else was watching, someone with the power to turn that small moment of connection into something transformative." He glanced at Alexandra, who stood nearby, her professional composure softened by the emotion of the moment. "Sometimes we think change has to be grand and sweeping to matter," Frank continued, "but often it begins with the smallest actions. Seeing someone truly, acknowledging their humanity, sharing what we have even when it seems inadequate. Ruth taught me that, and now her legacy will help ensure that no one else has to suffer as she did, invisible on the streets of our city." As he concluded his remarks, Frank gestured to Lily, now 9 years old, who stepped forward proudly. Together they pulled the cord that unveiled the plaque, officially opening the clinic that would serve thousands of vulnerable patients each year. The audience applauded, many wiping away tears. Among them was a familiar face that caught Frank's attention, the elderly woman from next door, Mrs. Garcia, who had so often helped care for Lily in their old apartment building. Frank had insisted she'd be invited, along with several other people from his former life who had supported him and Lily through difficult times. After the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, Mrs. Garcia approached Frank with a warm smile. "Look at you now, Mr. Big Shot Executive," she teased gently. "I always knew you were meant for more than sweeping streets." Frank embraced her fondly. "I was exactly where I needed to be then," he replied. "That job supported us when we needed it most, and now?" she asked, her knowing eyes taking in not just his tailored suit and confident posture, but the way Alexandra kept glancing in his direction from across the room. Frank smiled. "Now I'm still exactly where I need to be, just in a different way." His relationship with Alexandra had evolved gradually over the past months, both of them cautious for different reasons. Frank was protective of Lily, unwilling to introduce any relationship that might prove temporary. Alexandra was navigating uncharted personal territory, having prioritized her career over connections for most of her adult life. Their first real date had been almost comically formal, both of them overthinking every aspect until Lily had finally said, with 9-year-old exasperation, "Why don't you just watch a movie at our place like normal people?" That simple suggestion had broken the tension, leading to a new Sunday tradition, movies and homemade pizza with Lily, followed by conversation after she went to bed. Professional boundaries remained clear at work, but evenings and weekends increasingly found the three of them together, forming something that felt remarkably like family. As the reception continued, Frank made his way through the crowd, thanking donors and community partners. He spotted Lily deep in conversation with Dr. Chun, gesturing animatedly about something scientific that clearly fascinated her. His daughter had blossomed over the past year, her natural intelligence nurtured by the opportunities Alexandra had helped create. "Mr. Reeves?" Frank turned to find a young man in his 20s standing beside him, dressed in the uniform of the city's street maintenance department, the same orange coveralls Frank had worn for 7 years. "I wanted to thank you," the young man said, extending his hand. "I'm part of the new apprenticeship program, Harrington funded, the one that helps city workers pursue healthcare education while still working. I'm studying to become a paramedic." Frank shook his hand warmly. "That's fantastic. What's your name?" "Marcus Johnson. I've got a 5-year-old daughter, and before this program I couldn't see any way to advance my education while supporting her." His voice grew emotional. "You changed that. You showed that people like us matter too." The apprenticeship program had been one of Frank's first initiatives as executive president, creating pathways for service workers to enter healthcare professions while maintaining financial stability. It was his way of honoring the dignity of the work he had done while opening doors for others to grow. "People like us always mattered," Frank corrected gently. "The system just didn't recognize it. I'm glad we're changing that." As Marcus moved on, Alexandra approached, slipping her hand into Frank's with the easy familiarity that had developed between them. "The mayor just arrived," she murmured, "and the health department representatives want to discuss expanding the clinic model to other neighborhoods." Frank nodded, ready to return to the business at hand, but Alexandra didn't immediately lead him toward the officials. Instead, she turned to face him directly. "Before we dive back in," she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear, "I wanted to give you something." From her pocket, she withdrew a small velvet box. Frank's heart skipped a beat, his mind immediately jumping to conclusions that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. "Alexandra, what? It's not what you're thinking," she interrupted with a soft laugh. "Oh, I'm intrigued by your reaction. We can discuss that later." Her eyes held a promise that made his pulse quicken. "For now, open it." Frank lifted the lid to find a $20 bill, carefully preserved in a clear case. He looked up questioningly. "It's the same $20, Alexandra explained. "The one you gave Ruth that day. When I found her at the pharmacy, she still had it. She hadn't spent it yet because she said it was given with such kindness she wanted to make sure it went to something important." Alexandra's voice wavered slightly. "She let me replace it with enough for her medication and a place to stay. I've kept this ever since, waiting for the right moment to return it to you." Frank stared at the preserved bill, emotions washing over him, sadness for Ruth, gratitude for how far they had come, and something deeper, something that had been growing steadily in his heart over the months of working and living alongside this remarkable woman. "I thought today was fitting," Alexandra continued. 1 year later, full circle. "It wasn't about the money," Frank said quietly. "It was never about the money." "I know," Alexandra replied, her eyes holding his. "It was about seeing someone's humanity when the rest of the world had looked away. It was about giving what you had, even when it cost you everything." Around them, the reception continued, the buzz of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the future of their work unfolding in networking conversations and planning discussions. But in this moment, they stood in a bubble of shared understanding. "I've been thinking," Alexandra said, "about next steps for us." Her usually confident demeanor showed a rare vulnerability. "Lily mentioned last weekend that the guest room at my place could easily fit a desk for your home office." Frank raised an eyebrow. "Did she now? And what exactly prompted this interior design consultation?" Alexandra smiled. "I might have mentioned that I miss both of you on the nights you're not there, and she might have started listing all the logical reasons why it would make sense for us to, as she put it, just live in the same house already." Frank laughed softly, out of the mouths of babes. "She's not wrong," Alexandra pressed gently. "The three of us, it works. Better than I ever imagined possible." Frank thought of the journey that had brought them here. From a chance encounter on a city street to standing together at the opening of a clinic that would help thousands. From giving his last $20 to finding something far more valuable, purpose, partnership, and a love that had grown slowly but unshakably strong. "Yes," he said simply, "it does work. So let's not fix what isn't broken." Later that evening, as the three of them walked hand in hand toward Alexandra's car, soon to be their car, their home, their shared life, Frank glanced back at the clinic building. The sign bearing Ruth's name was illuminated against the darkening sky, a beacon of hope in the city. One small act of kindness had rippled outward, touching countless lives, including his own. Frank had given his last $20 that day on Monroe Street, never expecting anything in return. What he'd received instead was immeasurable, a chance to make real change, a partner who saw his worth beyond his circumstances, and the knowledge that sometimes the smallest gestures can transform the world. As Lily skipped ahead, chattering about plans for her next science project, Frank and Alexandra followed, their fingers intertwined, their paths now permanently connected by a simple truth: compassion, once set in motion, creates possibilities neither the giver nor receiver could have imagined. In the end, Frank reflected, it wasn't about how much you had to give, it was about giving anyway, even when it seemed too small to matter, because sometimes that was exactly when it mattered most.